In this lecture series, we're going to talk about scale and proportion. And especially in architecture, scale and proportion is one of the more important elements. Not that they're not all important. Um, it just is from the sense that we live in buildings. So if the scale and proportion are off, it makes the building and space really, really uncomfortable. You can always paint a wall if you don't like the color, or you can always change the furniture, but you can't easily fix the scale and proportion if it's off. So this is one of the ones that's just really, really important to good design. Okay, so we apply it to give a sense of visual balance and harmony. And it doesn't matter whether you're creating a video, a web page, or a floor plan, it is absolutely necessary to work with scale and proportion. Because without it, the work feels random and not designed at all. And nobody is going to come to us and pay us to design a space that doesn't feel designed at all, because that's our purpose. And good designs have a very well defined methodology for scale and proportion applied to them, meaning that you have a plan. In this image on the left, the photo was taken that was meant to show the scale and proportion between the government official on the building, who is larger than life, and the people. And it achieved the goal of doing that. So measure is broadly defined as, in our case, dimensions. Anything that is determined by a standard, and for us it is dimensions. It can also be volume, area, but we use dimensions to measure, or we use we use dimensions to define our measurements. Measure is obviously something that we do through time and space and other aspects of our lives. And so once upon a time, and you can see the drawing on the right that shows that we used to measure with our body parts because they were there and they were convenient. And this one actually shows you could still use this to count daylight. And it's really interesting because I've been out in the field doing photography and watch people, they judge how far are we from sunset, and it's pretty accurate, so it's cool. But now we have more sophisticated devices. So when we talk about size, we are referring to measurement. Scale then refers to the size of a work or form in relation to the average size of the human being. And at the end of this course, we're going to start talking about universal design and ergonomics. And we'll get more into that in more detail. So in one of your textbooks, Architectural Graphic Standards is a required textbook for every class because of how important scale and size are to what we do. So the majority of the rest of the world does use the metric system. United States uses the empirical system. And so you're going to see, different references throughout this entire program to both metric and feet, just simply because we no longer are isolated in a bubble. We work in around the world. I've done projects in other countries, and so it's really important to start to understand the metric system as well as the empirical system that we use. So size is always an exact quantity, like 3 inches, 12 points, 8 pounds. Scale, however, is relative. And so you can see here are some examples on the left of how scale is relative. And it shows you some examples, especially the one on the bottom, right, where you've got these paper clips have different sizes. And so the what happens in the first one is the larger the paper clip, the closer it is to you, because that's how we scale is informational. And then in the next one, we put the giraffe under the person. And so that implies that the giraffe is way off in the distance because we're familiar with those objects. And then on the right, all of them are the same size, and that is off for us because we know that those objects are not all the same size. And as we talk about, scale describes the size of objects in relation to others like them or to the things around them. And it is used to convey the importance of the subject. And you can see here that the Taj Mahal was actually a mausoleum. And the dome in the middle was the bigger dome, therefore the more important one. The scale on it makes it, the focal point makes it, the hierarchy provides that reference. SK. And so in these 4 different examples, the scale of the block is different. It could be in the first one, it suggests stone or block. In the right one, it appears to be brick. In the lower left, it appears to be tile, right? And so this is how scale changes. Even though the pattern remains the same, the scale of the pattern changes what the object could possibly be based on the fact that we understand there's a human in that picture, right? There's a human that we understand the size of a human. Based on that, we can look at this and guess about what that material is being shown. So human scale in architecture and art is a necessary consideration because how we feel, as I mentioned earlier, inside of a space is very important. There's something actually called neuroarchitecture, and it has to do with how our brain perceives architecture. And there was a building that was built in, I don't remember exactly where or when or what, but I just remember the context of the scale story, that the columns were structurally adequate, but because they appeared too small, the scale made them look like they weren't adequate. People were uncomfortable walking under the it was an area like a portico. They were uncomfortable walking under it. And so you have to take these kinds of things in consideration, because if people are uncomfortable in the space, we have not done our jobs. Now, people in these photos provide a reference to the scale of the architecture. In that one on the right, without those people, if you cover them up, I would have thought that was a lot smaller than it is. But the people help provide reference in scale. And so we always have to consider people, because people use our buildings. In architecture, we have something that is called an architectural scale. And it allows us to draw large objects on a smaller piece of paper by using a scale to make them proportionally accurate. And so what happens is, and we'll talk about how to use a scale. I think I have a video in here to link to that shows you how to use a scale. When we start producing drawings, we work with a scale so that we're doing a miniature version of our design, so that we're designing it correctly, because we want to be able to work to scale so that it's correct. Yeah, there we go. There's a video right here that you can watch that shows you how to use an architectural scale. He's already done this. I'll be happy to talk to you guys about this in any of our sessions if you want. But it is pretty much that 0 is your benchmark, and everything to the right is feet, and everything to the left is inches. And so by combining those together, you can create in this case, there's a 5 foot 6 inch line that would represent 5 feet 6 inches in real life, but it's been drawn at a scale of 1 inch equals 1 foot, meaning that on paper, an inch equals a foot in real life. So if I draw an inch on a piece of paper, that will translate to a foot in the real world. So when the contractor sees that inch and then they go to build something, they're going to measure out with their tape measure, which is a 1-to-1 scale ratio. They're going to measure out 1 foot. And so in this case, even though this line is drawn at 5 foot 6, is drawn at well, 5 inches, 5.5 inches is what it's drawn at because it's a 1 inch to 1 foot ratio. The contractor would build something that's 5 feet 6 inches. And that's how we get these large buildings on a small piece of paper through the use of scale. Okay, so take a look at the two different restaurant dining configurations in the images. How would you describe each of them using adjectives that are associated with scale? And how does the scale from the first differ from the scale of the second? Now, once you've analyzed these, which dining experience would you prefer and why? And now you're beginning to get and understand the real importance of scale. Scale also helps us determine where things are located. Just a couple examples of a bathroom. Okay, so here's the first thing that most people don't realize is one of the first steps of designing any building. How large should your rooms be? And so if I were to ask you, you're designing a house and you're working on the living room, how large should the living room be? How wide? How deep? How high should the ceiling be? And it's not there's no one right answer, right? So there's a way to determine that. And that is based on what goes in the room. So in order to design a room, we're going to start with what goes in it. How those fixtures, appliances, furniture, traffic pattern, circulation, how do those fit in that room? It's like a puzzle. How do we pack these things in a space? And so this page is some graphic standards that shows standard furniture, appliances, and fixture sizes, as well as necessary circulation space around them, as the basis for determining a room's function, therefore its scale. And the great famous Louis Sullivan said, form ever follows function. You'll often hear people say it as form follows function. And that is not always true. There are buildings that were designed where function was secondary and the form was the primary. But nonetheless, function was still factored in. And you will find people arguing and debating that. I personally think form and function should be balanced rather than one necessarily leading the other. But I will concede that when it comes to determining scale, function is the primary consideration. Because if it's not functional, if somebody can't use it, then in terms of what we do, it becomes not usable, or at least not as usable as it should be. And so this is really interesting that you can see a man in the photograph with Constantine's head. And if he wasn't there, you would really have a hard time determining or understanding how large that statue was. Also, conversely, the Mona Lisa is actually very small. I remember I didn't get close to it because there were all these people around it with a camera, and I had been in the museum for hours and hours before we got there, and I was tired. It was also towards the end of, a friend and I backpacked around Europe for 3.5 months. And Paris was towards the end of the trip. And I was kind of burnt out by then. So there were all these people gathered around this thing as if it was the last piece of food and they were starving. So I didn't get very close to it, but I was just shocked when I walked into the salon where it was, how small it was. And I think they did a great job with this photo of showing that. And so, the size of the work, in a sense, and in especially for houses that sell, right? That's one really cool thing about being an architectural designer, is that people buy your work. You're a painter. Your work might not get bought. But when you build and when you design a house, someone's going to buy it. And so its value can help determine its size. You're going to often see valuations on property are determined on the size, the square footage of the house on the lot. So this is pretty cool. This was a public exhibition. You see the building there. They projected on the building at night so that you got this really large head. And so the artist had to work large enough so the viewer would be able to get that sense of being overpowered by the imagery, which was the goal of the artwork. Now, we normally don't want to do those kinds of things, so we have to consider that we don't want to do those kinds of things. Okay, I'm going to stop here and continue in the next video.